Hi everyone, welcome to Azure DIY Season 4, Episode 6, Getting the Most Out of Your Data, Purview Deep Dive. This will be presented by Peter and David from Data Free. I've already seen a sneak peek of this one and there's a lot of amazing demos, so it should be a fantastic session. My name is Peter Cole. I'm an app dev specialist from Microsoft based in New South Wales, and I'm your host today. Based on what's happened this season, last week was, this week is of course getting the most out of Purview. Last week was rapid development with Power Apps, and that was Fu Shen. Fantastic session, will be on YouTube very shortly. Next week we have containerization and AKS running in Kubernetes. And then we're taking a bit of a break, and the rest of the sessions for Season 4 will be pushed to Season 5. So if you haven't signed up for next week's one, feel free to scan the QR code and that will take you to the sign up page if you want to be there for a live event. Or feel free to check out our LinkedIn group and scan that. We're also putting updates on there, and you can sign up through LinkedIn events. A little bit of housekeeping. This session is recorded and will be shared on YouTube and then LinkedIn. Please feel free to ask any questions throughout the session in the Q&A. You should see that at the top right of your screen, but a lot of these will probably be deep data questions, so I won't be able to answer them. So they'll most likely be picked up at the end by David and Peter in the last 8 minutes. A few cool Azure announcements that have come out recently. So there's 5 more free services available in the Azure free account. For anyone that doesn't know there's a lot of ways that you can get Azure free credits. If you sign up for an account, you can get 200 USD credits free for the first 12 months. But there's also it's different tiers for a lot of our different services that do have free tiers. And some of the cool ones that have just happened is Azure databases for PostSQL and MySQL now have a free tier. Key Vault have a small free tier, but the one that I'm excited about is Logic Apps. Logic Apps, you can now use 4,000 actions per month for free. So check that out on the pricing page for Logic Apps as well. The next one is Azure Dev Spaces is now retired as of May the 15th. So if you were using that for AKS, please move off it and move to Bridge to Kubernetes. And finally, general availability support for SQL Server in data flows using Azure Data Factory and Azure Synapse. So that's pretty cool. You can now modify your SQL servers through those flows and push data there fairly easily through the connections. So now I'm going to hand over to the main event, David and Peter from Data Free.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Peter and Gary, for setting this up. Hopefully those are now coming through, and we'll kick off. And first, a introduction. So my name is Peter Heydon. I am probably the data guy within the organisation, and so my team looks after solutions with data analytics at Data 3. And to my left is my good friend and colleague, David Summers.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Peter. My name is David Summers. I'm the Azure lead nationally here at Data 3. So I have one of those impossible tasks of trying to keep up to date with the 318 services in Azure.
And the way David keeps up to date, here's a few sort of pet projects on the side. There's a few links at the bottom of the screen there. We have the Azure Periodic Table, which is a way we help our customers showcase Azure services and high information and good links to resources. And if you ever need to do a Visio diagram and you wondered how to find that Azure stencil, David has curated a set and keeps it really well up to date when there's any updates coming out. So they're good resources there. And R3 is an organisation, you may not know us. We do a lot of licensing and increasingly doing a lot more Azure services. We're one of a handful of Azure expert MSPs, one of the highest accreditations with Azure in Australia. So today we're going to probably spend a lot less time on slides and on some action with Azure Purview. I'll give you a quick overview of why it matters and why it's important, and then Dave will take us through the provisioning around how to get it set up and started. And I'll take you through then how to actually use it and wrap up with some considerations as you think about how you might use Purview in your own organisation as well. So I'm hoping if you've joined today, you've got a little bit of awareness that, of Azure Purview. It's an in-preview service. It's relatively new, came into preview about November, December last year. And it's a unified data governance service that we can use in Azure to help us with all these sorts of things in blue boxes on the screen here around how we use our information. I've been a lot of questions, particularly the last few months. It's been a very hot topic around data governance, and things like data discovery is really important. How to understand, what we've got in our environment, and track lineage, so connections between a data source and where a data is being used, so we can start building those connections together. But also supports things like workflow, collaboration, integration, and so on. And while it does that, and why is it important? Why does it matter? So the things like, how do you find your data? We've all got data, a lot of organisations, every organisation has data silos, data in all sorts of places. So how do you find and use that information? How do you deduplicate that data? So multiple copies around the place, people keep it in silos. How do we start breaking those walls down? That traceability I mentioned before, to find out how data flows from objects in the organisation. Then as you start building this picture of your data estate, you start putting trust in that data, because now you know where it is, it's curated, and you've got experts and stewards associated to it. You now know I can use this data and know it's right and accurate. Risk is becoming a hot topic with customers, because managing information and knowing what you've got and how it's managed is really important for those risk parts of the organisation. And for all the developers in the audience, or those involved with making changes in the environment, change tracking is important, and building overall data culture is driving all those conversations also. To give you this has happened in the last couple of weeks, give you an idea of how change is one of those elements that impacts this. I had a colleague come to me who was using a Power BI, talking to a data source, and he asked me, why has Power BI started failing in their scheduled refresh every night? And when we looked at the error message, what we saw was something in the schema was changed. So the administrator for this application changed the schema, broke the reports, and had we had a tool like Purview in the mix, scanning and linking those together, and the right, I guess, the process around that, we'd have detected that, hey, there's a flow-on effect to this and probably other reports as well. So it's just a really minor, but a very common example that we see in a lot of organisations of how does change affect things going downstream. So I promised there'd be not much slides. That was it. So I'm going to hand over to David to take you through how to get Purview connected and provisioned and connected into some of the data sources. And I'll hand over to you, Dave.
Awesome, thank you. So first up, just going to show a Visio diagram of our demo environment. Now this came about after a conversation with Peter and myself a couple of weeks ago. So when we were preparing for this session, we decided to build an actual working demo with live data, so we can actually showcase some of the really cool aspects of Purview. So most of this demo environment comprises of the infrastructure that we're using to actually ingest data into Purview. So Purview itself is a relatively light, small service within Azure. But to actually provide context with this particular demo, we provisioned a virtual machine with the storage sync service so that we could actually bring in real-world files to then be scanned and classified and labeled. As well as that, we ingested data from a Sql database. Let me go off slide and straight into Azure. So the actual Azure components for Purview, as I mentioned before, are very, very light. So to create a new Purview environment, so let's spell Purview right.
I knew what you're after.
So the actual provisioning is very straightforward. So we just need to populate the normal metadata. Naming convention. And one important note is because this service is in preview, there's currently one region available, which is Australia East. Now, this is probably the most important aspect to consider when provisioning Purview. So when we're ingesting data from a data source, if we want to ingest data from PaaS service offerings like Power BI Embedded, Azure Data Lake, Azure Storage Account, Azure Sql Database, those services are publicly routable by default. However, we can use private endpoints and service endpoints to initiate a private connectivity between Purview and that data source. So as referenced in the design, we're using services like Azure Bastion, service endpoints, and private link, so that those publicly routable services are actually isolated behind the Microsoft Azure Fabric. So this is one important thing to be aware of. So here we're creating a private DNS integration. So we can then link Purview to our source, our data sources using these private DNS namespaces. Now here we select our capacity units. So we have two options at this stage in preview, so 4 or 16. Bear in mind this will have a cost implication on the Purview runtime. And one little key insider note is it's currently not possible to scale down. So our recommendation is to start small and scale up as required.
I actually think I read you, because in preview you can't even change it.
You can't change it.
No, it's a little gotcha as well. So looking forward to some of that more flexibility once it's in GA.
And our last component is tagging. And yes, I'm a big tag advocate. Everything should be tagged. And then review create. So it's about 4 to 5 minutes, but then once that has been provisioned, then you'll have this link here for Purview Studio. So you notice within the actual Azure service itself, there's really not much here. All of the magic happens within the Purview portal. So once we have provisioned Purview, and it's a matter of defining a collection. Now, a collection is a container for data sources that you want to ingest. So you could have a collection for production, non-production, dev test workload. Now within the actual collection, you then define your data sources. Zoom in here a little bit more. So in this pre-provisioned environment, we have two data sources. So I mentioned we have a file server with Azure File Sync. So we've mounted that Azure file share locally on our devices. We've then populated documents within that file share, which is then sync replicated into an Azure file container. And we then index that container. So if we click on view details here, so here we're connecting to just an Azure storage account. And we're using a managed identity that is provisioned when Purview is created. So that managed identity is an Azure AD application, which is a service principal that we then grant permissions within Key Vault. And then Key Vault then stores the API keys for the storage account. So that's a secure mechanism to allow authentication between service A and service B without storing credentials anywhere that can be exfiltrated. So once we define our data source, we then provision our, we then define our scanning schedule. So currently we have our scans set up on a weekly basis, but they can also be triggered as manual incremental or full scans. As well as that, we provisioned a SQL database. So very similar provisioning methodology here, in that we create a SQL database, we populated that with data. We then initiated a connection using the managed service account that's used by Purview into SQL itself. And then from within SQL, we then granted access to the managed identity as a DB reader. So that allowed us to then index at the table and row level an entire SQL database, and it'll take us through that.
Yes, just using AdventureWorks as an example. But one I'm hearing, Dave, is part of this is also identity for Purview, but granting that managed identity access to each of these data sources you want to connect.
Yeah, and that's the fun part that we found when we were actually building the demo. So I don't want a new connection. So this is an example of the data sources that you can register within Purview. And for me, this is what makes this a very attractive and compelling document and data classification scheme service is that the support for all of these different types of sources to ingest data into, and Purview has built-in categorization schemas for the fields that will be coming from these particular services. So the important delineation between this and other document management systems or classification systems is this works against structured and unstructured data seamlessly. So these are the two that we have configured, so Azure Files and Azure SQL Database, but we can also ingest from a whole bunch of other stuff. And the key thing here is knowing how to authenticate to these different data sources. So SQL Database is very easy. We can do this across multiple subscriptions. Once we've enumerated the subscription, then these are the SQL servers that we can connect to. And then we pick our endpoint. So this is the private endpoint that we have to provision against the subnet and VNet that our SQL server or SQL managed instance or IaaS instance of SQL is connected to. So once we define that, then it's a matter of adding the managed service account into that particular data source. So that's probably one of my key takeaways is understanding the data source you're connecting to and how to authenticate to it securely.
Now, as well, when I was doing this prior to Seven's demo, I struggled certainly around not understanding infrastructure identity and networking side of it as well as David to be able to do that together. So that's why when David walk you through that, because it's probably a bit trickier than if you're not used to using those managed identities to be able to make that happen.
All right. So we had some key takeaways as well based on our experience, which we are very happy to share. So the number one here is the actual resource provider. So if you're working within an environment that is restricted and controlled, which is a good thing, you may not have the resource provider for Purview registered against the subscription that you're deploying into. So that may be something that you'd have to escalate up to someone who has contributor rights to the subscription to enable the resource provider for Purview. The next is understanding how the managed identity for Purview works. So when you provision it, a managed identity is created within Azure Active Directory. Now that can then be used as an authentication endpoint for your data sources. The next and probably the most important one is to understand your networking and private connectivity options. So using private link service endpoints are critical to ensure that your any public endpoint is not actually publicly exposed. And do you want to talk about the permissions?
Yes, I'll touch on a bit more when I go through the next demo, but certainly I'm an owner of the resource inside of Azure. David provisioned it. However, when I went to go use it, I didn't have access to Purview Studio. So don't automatically get access to the studio without going and adding then certain roles. I'll take you through some of those roles in the next demo, but that was required to so get into that control plane around Purview that Dave showed you.
The other one was Power BI. That was a very interesting use case scenario for a data source. We did find some limitations in that when we initially provisioned Purview in a demo Azure AD tenant, which was not attached to our any of our Data3 resources, we found it impossible to do a cross-tenant connection specifically for Power BI. Now, this may be a preview limitation, We hope that is the case because Power BI ingesting into Purview is very beneficial. And the last thing which may cause a bit of confusion is behind the scenes how this works is Purview, when it's deployed, there'll be a managed resource group provisioned side by side. Now, a lot of customers will question, what is that? So we just wanted to highlight that behind the scenes, the mechanism for ingesting and bringing that data into Purview is performed by an Event Hub namespace. So this is a managed resource group which you don't need to look after, and the pricing for that is wrapped up into the consumption cost of Purview.
Yeah, great. So with that, let's switch gears a bit. And I'll take you through a bit of a walkthrough of being in the shoes of a data producer to be used to curate and surface the information. So I'm just going to switch browsers to my privileged account, administration account, and add myself here as a data curator on this this service. And now I've logged in, I have a range of options like you saw before that allows me to then find, manage and use the information in here. So let's start by actually looking at some of those data sources that David had configured against our databases and those Azure files that he mentioned. So first thing to do is browse those assets. Let's have a look at what we have. Now, as a technical user, I can understand the difference between a storage account and a SQL Server. This is a database and Azure files, but if you've got business users coming in and there's no differentiation for a reader role in here, that they'll see all that as well. So it maybe presents confusion as you start wanting to roll this out to your business users, but nonetheless, you can still navigate your way through. I'm going to go through onto the Azure Sql Database and have a look at what we have here. Here's that InventureWorks database. This is a sample that we can use for demonstration purposes. Now, I have on the left of my view here all the schemas under this database. I look at human resources. And under here, I can see the tables and the views that have been picked up by Purview when it's gone and done that scan. I'm going to explore the schema just for a moment and look at the details in here. So this is where we start seeing Purview in action, where we have classifications applied. And this is a custom classification that I've asked Purview to classify our data sources against. And it's part of our HR tag, if you like, that we've put in here. I can also see on the right-hand side the hierarchy and where this schema sits in sort of the broader system. So I know it's next to the database, next to the Azure SQL Server with the namespaces listed there. There are some properties as well, not a lot of detail in here at the moment. There's some other null properties as well, but probably what's most useful for those business users will be those contacts here. So for the HR part of this database, we know who our experts are within the organisation and who is the business owner of this as well. We have multiple owners also. So this provides a good leverage point for me to then go, all right, maybe I don't have access to that data. Maybe I want to know who owns that and how I can maybe get an extract or a connection to there. And I can contact one of our experts or the owner to know more. We also see what other entities are related. And we have the same view we had before with our hierarchy and then those items on the right, the tables and views. I'm going to go to another part of our database. I'm going to go down to the production schema into the product database for you right here. So I'm going to click through on that. Very similar view in terms of the hierarchy. And let's talk about classification for a moment, because I can now have a look at the schema, which are all the columns in that database. And I have a product number classified as a InventureWorks product number. It's another classification that we've applied here. So I was able to use a regular expression to be able to say, show me if it matches this expression, tag that as a product number that we may want to be able to track and filter and use across all our information assets. While my product number in our core system, there might be other files, either in unstructured files or in other databases where it gets used in reference. it's important to understand how those will be connected going forward. But that browsing is one way we can look at our files. Other ways to use search. So this is that Google-like experience, or Bing-like experience, apologies, to allow us to go find information across enterprise. This is really powerful because our search for employee, I can see the table that was in our human resources, a schema of our database, and I can find the files here as well. So searching across all our data assets. I can also filter based on the classification. Now, out of the box, you get a whole range of automatic classifications. The Hungarian Social Security number, New Zealand Ministry of Health features a lot. In this case, I'm going to date of birth. And I can see in here, it's going to, the only area that's about an employee and their date of birth is in this employee table. If I drill down to that, I can see the details here as well. Now, interestingly, I want to show you this table in particular because there's a little not quite good, but a gotcha, or at least a warning label for you. I actually edited the schema without it being classified automatically and gave this column A classification date of birth. Now, once I've done that, the label there says that this asset will no longer be updated automatically. So if I create a classification for anything, any column in this particular table, it's not going to pick it up. And there's no way to undo this that I've been able to find in the documentation or through trial and error through Purview to undo that. So I suspect that might be a feature that comes later once general availability is in place. But just a little bit of caution. But as you're going through this, try and use automatic classifications where it's practical. So now we've had a look around what we can find in here. Let's now show you another element of our information. It's one called Lineage. Now, this only pops up on our tables and in assets like Power BI. Now, there's not much information in here on this table because it's not connected to anything. And we can do connections with Data Factory and the data sharing. And Power BI is one that's really useful. Now, with that configuration that we found with Power BI, because we're trying to connect to our production instance of Power BI, and the change required for that for our demo purposes wasn't incongruence. I set this up in a separate tenant. I just recorded a short video and I skipped through the relevant sections to show you what the lineage looks like. So otherwise, Purview is otherwise configured exactly the same. And we're going to browse through our assets, and there's our Power BI on the right there. So just skip ahead. Now we're going to browsing down to explore one of the workspaces. This is a marketing workspace. So a lot of the same properties, the hierarchy is there. It's when we go down, I'm skipping ahead for time, into one of our reports that we start seeing the lineage take effect. So I'm going to go ahead a little bit further now. You can see the hierarchy on the right, but it's this lineage view that is in here, which is really powerful. So I can see here that my report on the right-hand side of the screen is connected to a data set, connected to a data flow, connected to a database. And now I have this visibility to go, how are my information assets all connected together? And when I've got lots of different data sources feeding a report or a data set, then it's us building a good picture around how this data is being used. And as we go further on the left towards our data set, I'm going to expand this one now, we can see there's actually, data flow, there's 3 data sets and 3 reports connected, feeding off this one database. And like that example I had on the slides before, and how I could change the schema, I can see downstream how that works. Now, I say you can see that in this view. I did find in the preview that when I go into Power BI, I can see everything end to end. If I navigate to that database and into Lineage, I couldn't see into Power BI. It was not showing. So maybe that's something that will come out once the service is generally available or in the fullness of time. But that will make it much more compelling when you're looking at either asset to then see it both ways as well. But so that will hopefully come.
That is really cool. I have not actually seen that lineage view.
No, you wouldn't have. I haven't shown that to you yet. Cool. And that's the kind of aha moment for me that goes, Right, because now a business user can visualize, that, back on the screen for a second, that image and go, oh, okay, this is what's been used. And oh, look how many things run off this system and how critical it is. We know people create reports. I mean, I think every organization uses Excel, it's the #1 BI tool in the world. And we pull data out, but we don't, it's all disconnected. We don't, and that's the problem, that's source of truth. So once we can start seeing this, we can start going, well, this is actually really important. We can curate this better, or provide enhancements around it, or manage change. All those good things we know we should be doing as technical professionals. So that's a bit about how to use the data there. Let me just show you a few other things in Purview that really helps them connect this together. Well, I'll go back to our. I forgot to show this before, so let's navigate back to our HR schema inside of here and just show you the details. Another thing we can do, as well as classifications, start adding glossary terms. I skipped over that before. And this allows us to write definitions across our different data assets, because what is HR, human resources organization, can actually be different in other organizations. People, we call Data3 OD and HR, organization development and human resources, a bit of a mouthful, but we'll have our own sort of different terms. And then people coming into the organization, it takes a while to get up to speed with how the language is used. And in certain industries, there's abbreviations galore. So you can start now applying these into your data assets. And I can click on that glossary term, and I can see, what does human resources mean? And it's a bunch of people working together, or the management of those bunch of people. I can create links to definitions, it's off to Wikipedia, and I can see what's related to the synonyms, related terms of children, and there's a payroll term here, and then the contacts are, and then so HR team members likely be the ones that own this term, and I can then create others and assign different people's responsibility. If I want to go add a new term, there's a list of those terms here. And I've got a hierarchical view as well, so I can see the relationships between a board and sales, so you create organizational relationships, or payroll and human resources. We can create different views the way the terms hang together. I'm going to create a new term to show you this in action. Excuse me. And I can first of all create a different, I can create templates for terms. I'm just going to use the out of the box one for now, and create one called collaboration. So you get to watch me clunk on the keys now, and hopefully spell things right. And it's 2 or more people working together, right? It's a really brief definition. I can have a parent if I want. I can add acronyms. I can add web URLs as well. I can related terms. So if I had similar terms, because if there were synonyms for the same term, which happens a lot as well, you can create those. But for now, I'm going to add David's going to be our expert in our here. I can add a label. Here's the collab guy, not just Azure. So, David doesn't do everything. I'm sure we get collaboration questions all the time anyway, and I might be the steward, right? So I in the definitions here on the left, who define the standards. So, and that would usually be a business owner in the organisation. I'll leave that rest now. Now, the other little gotcha, it took me a few moments because I didn't see it, but top right here, we have the status item as well. This will not be available to use until you make that approved, which is a little bit, and there's no workflow. This is the workflow, you're seeing it. It's me clicking that. And so you'll see in the takeaways on this that the workflow around approvals, there's no approval mechanism to go to a steward if I nominate someone, or if it expires, an expiry date on here, it doesn't exist. So it's up to a bit of a manual correlation to do that. Hopefully, again, we can use the preview excuse a bit today. That will be something that in time will be a feature that will get added, I'm sure. But now my collaboration term is here. Let's go to apply it to some documents. So I'm going to use the, I'm going to do search. I think I'll do search for collaboration. So what do I have already that might be tagged in the collaboration? I know in here, I've got Azure files.
So that was going to be one of my questions. Once you define that, do you need to rescan your data sources?
So good question. The terms don't get automatically applied.
Right.
It's a manual process. It's a classifications that will actually get, you can then provide a regular expression or a dictionary to do matching, automatic matching for you. So now you don't need to rescan for glossary terms, you do for classifications.
Right.
Subtle differences in there. So providing meaning or business meaning and context then versus the classification tagging to let you then filter things as well. And you can actually search and filter through search here in both cases. Now I have 4 files in my collaboration folder. The other thing that's interesting here is if I was to tag collaboration with a glossary collaboration, inheritance doesn't apply like you might think it would. So you think about how you might apply properties and it cascades downstream. Doesn't just happen. It's all gotcha. So I did that HR schema and I termed it and the classification. None of those tables picked that up either. So again, a little something to think about if you're used to that happening from information management perspective or applying properties. But we can do some bulk edits. And there's some, I was going to show you the management section as well for when you've got blob storage and maybe got a lot of JSON files coming from devices and sensors or other log files. You can apply that across the board sensors for in a broad sense for things in data lake or blob storage as well. So there is some automated stuff you can do for this. We won't explore all of that today, but I can show you how to do a bulk edit. So say these 4 files, I want to give them the same term. I can view those. I can now go into this view. I can do a bulk edit, and my attribute is going to be a term. So I can do a bulk classification owner or expert. In this case, I'm going to do add a term, and my collaboration is there. Little gotcha that drove me a little nuts for a few minutes was if you have a hierarchy and you have a parent, which I did for sales, for the life of me, I couldn't work out why sales wasn't appearing, but it's up here under the, because I've given the board, the Eventual board as a parent. So it drove me nuts, and I was rescanning and everything, and you silly Billy, it's right up here. And these appear straight away, so you have to rescan to have these made available. So I'm going to apply that attribute, and that will take effect in a few moments. Always take. I didn't make my. You made your sacrifice, demo guys, last night, but I certainly didn't. No. And there it is. So now if I go close that, and I now search for collaboration again. Let's try this out. It's probably there. Oh, that actually worked better than I expected from memory. So I can now, and I've got some selected. I do have my term. I can filter on collaboration and go, what's collaboration end up presentation, and show me just those files that apply there. Actually, it's showing me all 4. How interesting! Not showing me a subset. I don't know whether I've got those selected or not. What did I put there? Let's go back. But you get the idea that we do have a range of files here. We can find, search, and filter on relatively quickly. Let's just try it again, see what it does. Let's try presentation. It shows all 4, so it's capturing all rather than narrowing it down. So that's why it operates. Could be something to think about. I want to show you now probably one of the other useful areas of Purview is the insights. And this gives us the ability to see some high-level information as a data curator around Purview and what's in here. So I've got different asset types. So we've got how many assets are in SQL and Azure files, our file-based resource, how big that is, got 117 meg, and this will scale out as you have more and more in here. In terms of the scans, I can see as a data curator, I don't have access to the data, but I do have access to the data sources in this case. If I don't have access to them, I can see if it failed at any time. We had some issues last week with some networking things that Dave kind of fixed for me. But the 100 scans or so, or 20 or so scans I've run the last couple of days, yeah, I think it'll be succeeding. So that's a really good way to see that the system's working. The glossary here, this is actually really useful because while I have all these terms, create all these terms, and some organizations will have a enterprise classification scheme, they have these terms well defined. of organisations don't in reality. I can actually see where they're applied and approved or expired. I can see where they're incomplete. Now I can see that I'm missing multiple attributes, or I'm missing an expert, and I can start then taking proactive action to then drill down and go, right, well, there's an expert missing for this one, and I'm filtering that and then making those changes. So that's handy as someone who's the governance process over your glossary to see how that's happening. I'll go into classification in a second. The sensitive labels works if you have the M365 security compliance center configured, which we don't on this tenant. But those will come through here. That provides some of the sensitivity labeling for your information assets, and you can see file extensions for those information or data assets that have files associated with them. Now, in that file share that we created, mostly PDF files. So let's go to the classification. So it then ties into how we then create classifications on our assets. So in here, I can see that of my, we see when we provisioned the demo was around in end of May, and we now got 2 sources scanned, and that would just scale up as you add more data sources. Our type classifications are here, and then files and tables are shown. But probably most interesting is I go down to a table view, and I'm going to, I don't know if I need to zoom out or not, and it loads. I do. This is, I think, it's showing me a right-hand column there. So I'm just going to go, there is tables. I'll come back in a second. But I can then go, what's my top classifications for my tables, for example? I can see it's a person's name is coming up. And this is all automatic tagging that's happening by Purview. There's one of our custom tags is applying to one data source. In fact, it's two tables. In the files, I'll have some classifications in here as well, and the New Zealand Ministry of Health number. No disrespect to anyone who is joining us from New Zealand, but this may not be appropriate for your organisation, nor is any of these other national country-specific classifications. And you can change that, and I'll show you how to do that shortly. This allows us to then start thinking about understanding where is this information being used. I can go look at my payslip classification, because people do all sorts of weird, wonderful things, don't they, Dave? And I can click on this, browse assets, and go, oh look, someone's uploaded into a temp folder, which I'm sure has happened to many people, a whole list of employee ID information. And find information that's maybe not supposed to be there. So it helps with good data governance practices to find that out. And what I haven't thought about until now, some alerting mechanisms and some actions and rules based on this would be a great, I think, great thing to see in Purview in future releases as the product grows and matures. But already you can start seeing value out of using Purview, hopefully seeing value out of using Purview across your environment. So let's look at then how do we get the classifications working? And this was, I guess, a bit of a bugbear for me, but I think I've worked out and explained to you today kind of how it hangs together. So there's a range of things in here. I'm not going to go through all of these right now. There's some, you can explore this in your own instance. There's our scan rule sets. If you're running pulling data that's on premises, you've got a hybrid deployment environment, you can create your integration runtimes into those on-premises databases. Metrics just goes out to the Azure Monitor, and it's just looking at the scan statistics, whether it's scan successful or not. But the real piece here is the classifications. Now, the classifications, here are all the classifications that we've seen around, such as the New Zealand Ministry of Health number. All the Australian classifications that are available to you, provided by Microsoft out of the box. So you can start finding things like a text file number within your information assets, or bank account numbers, or it might be around a PCI requirement to find where a credit card number is stored and used. And this scanning will happen based on things like patterns, makes it easy to find. Now, they're great, but how do I create my own? Now, the first thing is you create a classification. Use a hierarchical namespace. So the formal name might be, in this case, company name .department.entity. And have a think about how to best structure it for your organisation. If you go to more than 2 levels, such as HR to employee ID, display name is just on those last 2. So it'll do that for you. But to apply the rules, I'm going to go down to my classification rules section, metadata management. I can't change any of the out-of-the-box ones from Microsoft, but I can go into custom and I can apply different patterns. So there's a regular expression pattern there for the product number or the employee number that I've used for setting this up. I can also use a dictionary, which I've done for the employee ID. It's basically a sample of employee IDs that I have, which allows us to then use a dictionary of known terms. If you see beyond the threshold of 10% of the data in that column, for example, then classify as an employee ID classification where that employee ID is showing up. Setting those up are relatively easy. You can test them as well. First, edit this one for a moment. It's just create it, tell it's a regular expression, and then you can test uploading a file to be able to do that pattern matching and test whether it works. And that was where my downfalls was I went, this is really working well, my regular expression is correct, happy days, nothing was coming up. Nothing was being classified and you had that information in it. And then I went, maybe it needs rescanning, and I rescanned, and the definition of scanning, do things more than once, expect a change. I was starting to get a little insane. Finally worked it out through just some of the documents, maybe misreading documentation on my part. It wasn't quite explicit, but to configure that, you've got to tell it to use these classifications. It doesn't just pull them automatically. That's where these scan rule sets come into play. So for every source type, and let's use the files, for example, this is what Microsoft gives you out of the box. I can configure my own custom scan sets. So inside of here, I've one for the Sql database and one for Azure Files. And they work pretty much the same. I'll show you the Azure Files one. I can tell it I think the next screen is extensions to scan for. I can add my custom extensions as well. Whether I can read some of those or not I haven't tested that. If I continue, then I can then say, which rules do I apply? This is where I was able to tick these 3 classifications, which is that first one on the left here I've shown you, as well as the I can choose whether to not apply the Australian or non-Australian patterns in here as well. The last missing piece, after going, well, that seems good, it's working now, was not the case. You actually now have to go and set that up against your data source. So if we go to a data map, which back when Dave showed you, probably a half an hour ago now, and go into our data sources, you have to go and into the details of our Azure Files, exactly the same thing for Azure SQL. Go into the scan rules. You now need to edit the scan, and you then need to go to the next page. I think it's next page. It's one of these pages here. Next one after that, and pick the custom scan rule set that you've created. Once you've done that, and you then run a scan over the top of that, classifications will start working. Almost. So they do work, and what was happening was adding files in manually, and they were coming up. So I could browse to my data asset, so go to show you just where I was using that. I'm the guilty party of adding these files into the temp directory to see whether it's picking those up or not. So I'll show you what those look like. Let's look at these are all, because I understand why they're here, but the classification is picking up. There it is, Schema Classifications. I was trying different techniques to, that's the dictionary and the regex, so both are applying here. These won't show up for new items, not for existing. I tried deleting them off Azure Files, rescanning, adding back in, rescanning. Didn't work. In a moment of frustration, I was navigating around, hit this refresh button in Purview, and there appears to be a client-side cache within the web app that then popped up. So if you're used to, as a developer, or a general user of the web, which is everyone, browsing around and the page refreshing for you doesn't quite behave that way. There's a little gotcha. So hopefully that saved you a few hours of frustration, like it did for me, trying to work out how that connects together. Before I then jump to the takeaways and then kind of was wrapping things up, open for questions. There's a few other things in here. I haven't set up data factory or data shared, which connect those in. Those pattern rules was where you asked before. Those can we want to apply some of these things? Like I said, those unstructured data, and you have a namespace that might be right. This container within a data lake storage is all going to be this type of thing. You can then do parameters for dates and the like. You can apply those here and do that. Access control just points you to the access control inside of regular Azure, the access IAM, and then the credentials. This is that managed account key that Dave talked about as well, is in here, but probably best configuring it outside of here.
Yes.
Okay, so the last thing is, I'm going to show you, is as a non-privileged user, I can create a reader role. So this is my non-admin account. I can go to the URL web.purview.azure.com. I can pick my instance of Purview. It's going to validate my permissions and let me continue. And I get a different view, very similar but different view. I can certainly do all the search, do all the browsing. Obviously, it's refreshing as fast as I would like today. I can see the glossary, I can view this, I can't manage it. Now I can browse my assets. I can't add assets. You notice the data map icon on the left here is gone. But there's a way you can allow your non-privileged users access to start using and searching, finding information, which is really good. And this experience, I'm sure, will get better as well. A little word of caution: if you're used to things like SharePoint, I was a SharePoint admin back in the day. Well, yes, we all were. I'm sure some of you still are. I answered the question plenty of times. I've got a file in here. I don't want to come up and search, and you'd have to show them. Go right. Here's a user doesn't access that file. Search doesn't come up. Happy, and that's fine. You have to have the right controls around that. Purview, just as a heads up, is different. Now, you can't access those files, can't access that payslip data, can't access the tables in my employee database. I can see all the metadata around that, and that does not differentiate based on your role. Now, my non-privileged account doesn't have access to any of those assets that we created, yet I can browse exactly what's in there. I can browse those tables. I can see what's in Azure Files, and I could potentially see those payroll information that someone left there and go, oh, that's interesting, and what's in there, but I can't open that file up. I can view the details, but I can't see the content itself. And there's, look, put your tax identification number in there. So it's interesting, but then it's just a different behaviour pattern. I think it's a good idea. I really don't like having lots of silos we talked about before. I think having access to information, then going, who do I contact for this document or this, and having those experts listed there, and then having a conversation.
Absolutely, and because I'm very security focused, if as an information worker I had access to view the content of those files, I see that as very, very dangerous. But from an audit and compliance perspective, if we did have a third party come in to do a GDPR sweep across our organization, then this is a really good mechanism to grant them the least privileged access to actually scan the metadata, and then with the contact information here, reach out to notify that person, hey, you have you have a couple of breaches here which you need to remediate.
Absolutely. Interesting to see how, as time progresses, you can then start seeing who has permissions to those information assets too, and to understand, I guess, how people are using that, and or active access to things that maybe they shouldn't. So you can do audit on the permissions as well. That'd be another feature.
We'll add that to Microsoft. Adding to our feedback to Microsoft on preview features.
Okay, so I've talked about most of these here, so I'm not going to dwell on very much. There are a data curator and a reader roles. With the classifications, if I don't have access, a data curator doesn't have access to update the data sources, but I need access to data sources to apply the scan set rules. So If I didn't have access, I need to talk to an administrator to have a conversation around, hey, can you start applying this set of classifications against these data sources? That's something in there as well. I mentioned, between business users having a view of systems versus data, but I think it's good to people understand a little bit of education training, sensitive labels. I talked around that. Talked about the Power BI lineage. The workflow can be improved around the glossary. Make sure you approve your terms. Talked about permissions and find metadata. Do you need to rescan to apply new classifications? Talked about inheritance. I was worried when I started tagging people in our organisation that they're experts or stewards. I went, oh, are these spamming people? They do not. So that's maybe good for you to know as well. I've tagged you a bunch of times. I think I've tagged myself to get the emails. And the classification rules is the, how to go from classification rules to classifications to scan rule sets to scan to data sources. Probably, once you go around that, everything sort of made sense. And you can then choose what you want to have there. And you need to be able to, the role is the Purview data source administrator to manage your data sources. And refresh, this is my new friend at Purview. So to wrap things up, broad considerations, Dave. Here's a few that we've put together. Just think about how Purview might get used generally and broadly. Requirement, I think, is after a lot of conversations. You've heard it saying. Yeah, people are asking questions around. Now's the time to start thinking about it. Still in preview. It is in Australia East, as David mentioned. There's preview T's and C's. Documentation lags a little bit. It's going to be improved. I've got full faith it's going to be improved. I talked about lineage as possible between data factory and data share. I didn't show it today, but that is there. If you're used to looking about other enterprise data governance solutions, you might also think about things like data quality or master data management. This is not there, and I don't know whether that'd be a feature of it. Probably not data quality. Maybe data master data management. Not sure. It's not there now, so don't sort of think it's going to be ready for that. Certainly have your own solutions if you need that requirement. Deploying Purview is quick and easy. When Dave and I were talking, he did it while we were on first initial conversation and set it up, gave me access.
14 minutes.
14 minutes.
and that was also provisioning the VM, the Azure file share. Yeah.
And that's your first time deploying Purview?
Yes.
Yeah. And kicking data source. So it is quick. Making it meaningful takes time, and part of that is also engaging your business stakeholders, particularly information management, the governance, risk users are going to get a lot out of this as well. Get them involved on the journey. There's an outline for a pilot deployment that gives you some guidance for that. And try connect to data source, deploy it, connect to data source, kickstart a conversation, show them. This is a really good way to get started. To have a conversation, they can see it. Show them this demo, the recorded demo could be a good way as well. Even though it's in preview, you will get charged for the service for some of the elements. So that's just again as a heads up for you as well. A lot of the data map was free until end of May, but some of that's now starting to hit the meter. If you need to do business continuity disaster recovery, so again slowly, business continuity or disaster recovery. It's manual currently. It does say it's coming, but if you do need BCDR, you need to basically run a separate service and replicate all the work you do. But that is coming. And consider the broader ecosystem. So this is a reference architecture. I don't expect you to be able to see that, but the bit in green at the bottom is where Azure Purview is as a previous service has been featured here for many months. This is your discovery and governance tool. I was in a call yesterday at the Microsoft Envision call, which is with business customers worldwide. It was the only Azure service I mentioned in 90 minutes around business problems and focus, and it got raised by one of the heads of Microsoft around data governance, saying we've created this service to help people with things like GDPR, compliance requirements, the whole governance conversation. So it's getting a lot of attention. And it's something that a lot of organisations now need to be able to think about. Now, sort of data now going cloud, on-premise is everywhere. How do we start managing that? And discovery is even itself a very valuable tool to know what you've even got. If we start thinking about how you apply governance, you can find things there as well. So, general availability. It's been in preview since November. I binged and Googled everywhere to find when it'd be available. I've got no inside knowledge on this, and I did come across on a public-facing service around where the service is deployed in each of the regions. If you hover over little blue square, it popped up with GA expected Q3 2021. So next quarter is the current, I guess, expectation of when Purview might become generally available, which is exciting. I think that organizations, they probably hold off from trying a lot of preview features or start using those in a lot of gusto, I guess, to get started. So I think that's why the time is now, because this is coming, and it'd be very useful for all those reasons we've outlined. You've seen how that can be applied, and it's going to get time to ramp that up and make it useful. So I expect you start thinking about it now, start doing those trial deployments. You'll be ready for when it's available, and you're well positioned to then start rolling that out and getting more users engaged outside of a small pilot group as well. So that's it. We made it to the hour. I think I'll hand it back to you, Peter, in a moment. Thank you very much for joining us today. Contact details for David and myself are there. We'll have a good QR code, so you've got two you can scan. Hope that was useful. Please, if you'd like to know more about that or how Data3 can assist, please contact David or myself. I'd be more than happy to help. With that in mind, is there any looking at the questions there, David, anything key, anything there that we haven't touched on already, or come up and maybe get like one or two questions?
So our Microsoft friends have been very good at moderation. So we only had one question for Dataverse availability into Purview. That's on its way, and a very, very timely question regarding delineation of permissions with different data sets. So the ability to say, well, the HR team, they can query the HR data set. So being able to restrict who can query different sets of data.
So as you saw, we can't do that right now, but you can create multiple instances of Purview in your Azure tenancy. And you can have those instances effectively scanning, each other's data, lots of data sets, the same data sets. That is probably the way. Within the Purview service itself, it's really only a reader, curator, and an administrator type role, and there's nothing further at this stage that I can see.
We'll add that to the feedback list.
Absolutely. We'll just send this recording. Peter, is anything else? I'll hand it back to yourself. I think there's a lot of questions. So thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter and David. Absolutely killed it. Fantastic session today. So anyone that's on call or watching this on YouTube, please feel free to reach out to them. You can go through their QR code or hit them up on LinkedIn accordingly. And hopefully we'll see you next week. Thank you, everyone. And we'll end it there.